Welcome to HR Analytics in Excel. Let's get started. In the people analytics cycle, you see that you can start with asking the right questions. If you have a question that's relevant for the business and that's specific enough to be answered by data, then you can go to step 2, which is about data selection. In step 3, you combine and you clean the data. In step 4, you do the actual data analysis. And in step 5, you interpret it and you go on to execution. And take something that keeps either the CEO awake at night, something that's in line with organizational strategy, or something that is really important to HR internally. But do pick something of strategic relevance. That's important to always keep in mind. Second, pick a problem that applies to a part of the organization. Don't try to analyze all of your workforce unless you work for a very small company. Why? Because you'll spend way more time data cleaning and combining the data and making sure all the data is ordered in the right way than you will doing the analysis and actually doing something with the findings. It's easier to apply a data model to 10% of the organization and then try to generalize it and add another 10% of the organization to the same data model than to try to analyze the entire organization immediately and then come up with quick results. Start small, make sure you continuously learn and get better every single time. The third thing to keep in mind is that you should prepare to get actionable results. It's really interesting to see a difference, for example, in performance between males and females, but is that really interesting? Maybe you're trying to find out whether there's implicit discrimination within the organization. Then it might be interesting. But honestly, it's rather hard to change someone's gender or to stop hiring males and just to start hiring females. Make sure that the problem that you're trying to solve and the data that you're using, that it can all lead to actionable results. That's important. Every good research starts with a number of hypotheses. Why? Because hypotheses force you to think in a really specific way. It's very tempting to just start with the data and then dig through the data and do all kinds of fancy things. Without an hypothesis, it's going to be really hard to come up with actionable results. In the next step, you use both literature and the hypothesis to select the relevant data and variables. A lot of companies start by just digging through data and trying to answer the question without looking at literature. And usually after they've successfully completed a number of projects, they then see that almost everything they did was already in literature. The state of literature in the field of applied psychology is very advanced. Do leverage all the insights in literature because it will help you select the right variables, select the right data. It will give you a reminder of what variables you really shouldn't forget to include in your analysis. And usually literature will help you to come up with a number of actionable ways to solve concrete issues. Now, when you select your data and variables, remember that more is not always better. Usually it's easier to just select the bare minimum variables and then later add other variables. Again, the Pareto principle, the 20-80 rule, is very important. Take the variables that are of critical importance and then at a later point you can add additional variables. Lastly, when you formulate your hypothesis, be aware of your research design. For example, if you want to find an association between two different variables, that's going to be a different design than if you want to know whether A causes B. Because if you want to find a causal relationship, you either need to adapt a longitudinal data design, which means that you need data over time and you can relate the data from 2013 to 2014 and the data from 2014 to 2015 to see if there's a cause and effect. Or you can find a very solid confirmation in literature that there is a causal effect and then try to find a correlation between two different variables, which is a less robust design. But then again, the analysis you do does differ based on the hypothesis that you have. That's the important thing to take home. Already think about the research design and the type of analysis that you want to do and make sure to read about it and to know how to do the analysis. In other words, pick a problem, formulate a concrete hypothesis and keep in mind what kind of analysis you want to do. Select your variables when you research your hypothesis and look through the literature to see what other people have written about the same problem that you're researching. And do write those variables down because they'll come in handy when you start to combine and clean data. Selecting the relevant data is a very important aspect of doing research. And there's three things to keep in mind. First of all, the level of analysis. For example, say you want to relate individual engagement to performance. If you relate individual engagement to individual manager-rated performance, that's a good research setup. Why? Because you stay on the individual level. Another solid research setup would be to relate individual engagement to team performance. Why? Because the team consists of multiple engaged individuals, and scaling up an individual level to a team level introduces a bit of noise, but there's still a strong signal and you'll be able to find that signal if there's really an effect. However, if you want to scale individual engagement levels to organizational financial performance, for example, then it's going to be much harder because, first of all, the effect will most likely not be the strongest between individual engagement and financial individual performance. Scaling it up to organizational factors will introduce a lot of external variables that can influence the effect and thus diminish it. For example, how well is the economy going? What are the dynamics in different teams? Because you're also skipping the team level when you relate individual to organizational level. All those different variables can act as confounds or can act as variables that reduce the impact of individual engagement to organizational performance. So to relate it to statistics, you can make the step from one level to one level higher and scale it up. An individual input relates to a team level output, or a team level input relates to an organizational or departmental level output, but don't make the step of individual input to organizational output, because the chance of you getting some informative and actionable findings will be really, really small. And positive findings might very well be false positives, null findings. So think about the level that you're doing your analysis on and try to stay within that level. If you measure individual engagement to individual performance, then you can probably relate individual performance to team performance and then team performance to organizational performance, but it will be much harder to relate individual engagement directly to organizational performance. Context is king. Certain teams will be able to perform better than other teams just because they're in a better context. Absenteeism will differ from Department 1 to Department 2 because of a difference in context, for example, a different manager, a different organizational subculture, etc. Take context into account, and if you can measure it, measure it. If you can't measure it, do interviews, talk to people. If you see something weird in the data, ask about it. Doing that will help you explain certain outcomes, and it will help you quantify specific data points that are relevant for your analysis, for example, leadership style, management style, etc. A third element that you need to keep in mind when you select relevant data is complexity in outcomes. Let me ask you a question. How would you measure performance? Pause the video, take a few minutes, and write it down. How would you measure performance? The big question is, who are we measuring performance for? Is it our sales team? Then sales revenue might be a good way to measure performance. But then again, sales revenue isn't necessarily the best outcome, because if certain people work on big deals and other people work on small deals, deal size is not necessarily a good proxy. Because if you look at the context, as we saw in the previous slide, bigger deals are worked at by more people. So is sales revenue then a good way to measure successful job outcomes? Maybe someone who's bringing in 400k of small deals performs way better than someone in a large team who brings in 2 million in deals. So sales revenue isn't necessarily a good outcome for your salespeople. Maybe it's a number of sales, because that would equal people with big deals and people with smaller deals. But then again, when you are involved in big deals, it's going to be way harder to get the same number of deals than when you work with smaller size deals. And especially if you work in big deals and you can bring in 5 or 10 deals a year, then the number of sales is a really small number. It's hard to discriminate between high and low performance. So sales performance could also be related to the number of contacts that you have. Because as a salesperson, you need to network, you need to know a lot of people, so the number of contacts might be a good process outcome for performance. Or maybe it's a number of phone calls, because if you're in touch with a lot of different people, you're much more likely to get better deals. Think about the relevant outcomes that you want to select and that you want to do research on. An outcome could also be customer satisfaction, or manager-rated performance, or peer-rated performance. Managers rate differently compared to peers. So really do think about how you're going to measure what you want to measure, because there's multiple ways to do it. And oftentimes, especially when you work with small data, with small numbers, taking something, and for example, you're bringing in 10 sales on average, taking the number of phone calls or the number of hot leads is a better way of measuring performance outcomes. Why? Just simply because there's more of them. And because there's more of them, it's a better way of predicting how many actual sales someone will make in the end. Really think about how are you going to measure performance. And in terms of performance, don't be afraid to include 2 or 3 ways of measuring performance. Why? Because in this case, more data is often better. And that's not only taking more different variables, but also in one variable, make sure you have sufficient data to have sufficiently discriminatory value in order to really see the difference between low performance and high performance. So think thoroughly about your data selection. Now, when you work with data, there's a number of things you really need to know. The first one is construct validity. And construct validity is all about, are we really measuring what we should measure? Are we measuring performance, or are we measuring how well the manager likes someone? Or is the combination of both? In that case, construct validity is low. Reliability is all about, will the outcome be the same when we measure twice? So today I take an engagement survey, in 2 weeks I take another engagement survey, and we assume that engagement is a state of mind that doesn't fluctuate too much day by day. In that case, we want the first outcome to be similar to the second outcome, because there's only 2 weeks in between and engagement shouldn't really fluctuate too much in those 2 weeks. That's all about reliability. And reliability is often expressed in Cronbach's alpha, if we talk about questionnaire skills. The third thing is generalizability. Will our outcomes apply to others? If we research just one group, will those outcomes also apply to the second or the third group? That's really important to keep in mind, and that also has to do with your actionability. Does your research among your key account managers also apply to your HR people? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. Funny thing is that especially validity and reliability are related to each other. And that's something that a lot of people forget. For example, if you have a very low reliability, your construct validity usually is also lower. Why? Because you're not really measuring what you should measure. Why? Because there's a lot of variability in the outcomes, so you're probably measuring different things. This picture gives a really nice representation of it. You can have reliable and not valid results, so you're really consistent in your findings, but you're not finding what you want to find. You're missing the target again and again. You can have very valid results which are absolutely not reliable. On average, you're trying to measure what you should measure, but the outcomes are very dissimilar. And in this case, when reliability is very low, validity is usually also lower. You can have results that are neither reliable nor valid, and you can have results that are both reliable and valid. So they're highly concentrated, very similar, and they're on target. But then again, as I said, when reliability is low, usually validity also suffers. This was a short introduction into the basics of working with HR data. To sum up, make sure you attack a relevant business problem and you make the problem small. Think of the Pareto principle. Make sure that you look at literature, what other people already found, and you apply it and you use it for your data selection. And once you start to select data, make sure you select the right data. Think of different levels of analysis. Think of how you're really going to measure the things that you want to measure, and keep validity and reliability in the back of your mind. And if everything checks out, you can actually do an analysis that has relevant business outcomes. But remember, only research things that will yield actionable results.